Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
Picture this moment that still haunts my quieter nights, when the clock strikes 1 in the morning in our unassuming suburban home just outside Chicago, where the streets are lined with maple trees that whisper secrets to the wind. And suddenly, there's this insistent knock echoing through the stillness like a thunderclap in a library, jolting me from a fitful sleep tangled in sheets that smell faintly of the lavender detergent Sophia always insists on using. My heart racing as I stumble to the door in my worn flannel robe, peering through the peephole to see my daughter standing there on the porch under the harsh glow of the motion light, her face a heartbreaking canvas of bruises swelling across her cheek and jawline. Tears carving salty paths through the smudged makeup she never quite mastered, and as I fling the door open to pull her inside, she collapses against me with a sob that rips through the night, murmuring in a voice broken by pain and exhaustion, "He hit me again, Mom." Because of her, those words hanging in the air like smoke from a fire I hadn't realized was raging so close to home, prompting me to guide her gently to the living room couch where we sink together, her body trembling as I stroke her hair. The same dark waves she inherited from her father, who never made it back from his last deployment overseas, and in that instant, a calm washes over me, not born of resignation, but of the disciplined resolve forged in my 20 years as a Marine sergeant. Leading me to rise without a word, cross the dimly lit hallway to the wardrobe where forgotten relics of my service life gather dust, and carefully extract the garment bag containing my old uniform. Its fabric still carrying the faint scent of desert sand and gun oil from missions in places I'd rather forget, before I retrieve my phone from the side table and dial the secure line I've kept active for emergencies just like this one, speaking into it with a steady voice that belies the storm. Inside. "It's time. Begin the plan," as Sophia lifts her head, eyes wide with a mix of confusion and dawning hope, wondering what web of strategy her mother is about to unravel in the face of such raw domestic betrayal. We sat there in the soft lamplight for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the house creaking around us as if sharing in our shared grief, while Sophia gradually unfolded the evening's horrors between sips of the herbal tea I brewed to steady her nerves, describing how Mark, her husband of 3 years and the high school history teacher everyone in our tight-knit community praised for his engaging lectures on American ideals, had exploded in a fit of jealousy-fueled rage after another late night at what he claimed were faculty meetings, his accusations centering on this enigmatic her who seemed to embody all his insecurities and failures, a woman whose shadow loomed over their marriage like an uninvited guest at a family dinner. And as she spoke, tracing the fresh welts with tentative fingers, I listened intently, my mind already cataloging details for the operation ahead, recalling how I'd first noticed the subtle shifts in her demeanor over the past year, the way her laughter had faded during our weekly Sunday brunches at the local diner where we'd split plates of pancakes dripping with syrup, her excuses for Mark's absences growing thinner than the crust on those overbaked pies, yet I'd held back then, respecting her autonomy as a grown woman navigating the choppy waters of adulthood in a world that still expected women like us to soldier on silently, much like the female vets I counseled at the VA where I worked part-time shifts folding paperwork and offering quiet encouragement to those haunted by their own battles. But tonight crossed every line I'd drawn in the sand of my patience, transforming vague concerns into a call to arms. And as Sophia's story wound down with her admitting she'd hidden similar incidents before to avoid the mess of divorce in a town where gossip spread faster than flu season, I shared a small, wry anecdote from my training days to lighten the heaviness, joking about how in the Corps we learned that the best defense was a good offense, though in civilian life it often meant outsmarting the enemy with paperwork rather than firepower, eliciting a faint, watery smile from her that felt like the first crack of dawn after a long vigil. With the tea gone cold on the coaster, I outlined just enough of the plan to reassure her without overwhelming her fragile state, explaining that my old squad mates, a network of retired Marines scattered across the Midwest like reliable checkpoints on a long haul, would start gathering intelligence on Mark's routines and finances by morning, leveraging skills honed in far-off deserts to expose the cracks in his facade without immediate risk to us, and as I described Jax, my former corporal now, running a discreet investigation firm out of Detroit, with his knack for uncovering digital trails that civilians like Mark left carelessly online, Sophia's grip on my hand tightened, a flicker of empowerment replacing some of the fear in her eyes. Though I could sense her internal tug-of-war between relief at my intervention and the lingering loyalty to the man she'd vowed to love in sickness and health, a promise now tainted by the physical evidence blooming on her skin like unwanted tattoos. We moved to the kitchen then, the clock ticking past 2 as I heated leftover soup from the fridge, the aroma of tomatoes and herbs filling the space and grounding us in the mundane rituals of home, where I probed gently for more on her, learning fragments that painted a picture of office flirtations or perhaps an old college sweetheart resurfacing via social media, each revelation fueling my determination to dismantle Mark's world piece by piece, starting with anonymous tips to his school principal about irregular after-hours activities that might raise eyebrows during budget reviews, all while injecting a touch of humor into the tension by quipping that if teaching was his cover, we'd make sure his lesson plans included a chapter on consequences, drawing a reluctant chuckle from Sophia that eased the atmosphere just enough to let her drift off on the guest bed upstairs. Alone again, I pored over the initial report Jax emailed, photos of Mark at a dimly lit bar with an unidentified woman whose profile matched the vague descriptions, her laughter captured in a candid shot that screamed trouble, and as I cross-referenced it with Sophia's accounts, a deeper unease settled in, hinting that her might entwine not just Mark's secrets, but threads from our own family history I'd long buried under layers of Midwestern stoicism, leaving me staring at the ceiling as the night deepened, the plan's first threads weaving tighter around us all, with the promise of revelations that could either heal or shatter what remained of our fragile bonds. Dawn crept in slowly that next morning through the half-drawn blinds of my modest kitchen in our quiet Chicago suburb, where the maple leaves outside were just starting to turn shades of amber and gold as if nature itself was preparing for the upheaval about to shake our lives, and I stood by the counter nursing a mug of black coffee that burned going down, its bitterness mirroring the resolve hardening in my chest while Sophia still slept upstairs in the guest room, her soft snores a temporary reprieve from the nightmare she'd stumbled into the night before, allowing me a moment to review the preliminary intel Jax had forwarded overnight via our encrypted channel. Documents detailing Mark's erratic financial trail that snaked through online gambling sites and unexplained withdrawals from joint accounts meant for their mortgage on that starter home 2 blocks over. The one with the white picket fence that screamed all-American normalcy but hid bruises and secrets beneath its pristine facade. I scrolled through the attachments on my phone, the screen's glow casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floor worn from years of pacing during late-night worries about deployments and deployments past. Noting how Mark's credit card hits clustered around seedy bars on the city's outskirts and dinners at upscale bistros that no teacher's salary could justify without some under-the-table side gig. And interspersed among the receipts were blurred photos of him cozying up to a woman with sharp features and a laugh that, even in still images, seemed too loud for the subdued world of high school faculty lounges, her identity still fuzzy, but her presence a glaring red flag waving in the face of Sophia's vague confessions about this elusive her, who ignited Mark's tempers like dry tinder under a match. Jax's notes speculated she might be a fellow educator or perhaps a vendor sniffing around school contracts, but the real kicker came in the form of email fragments where Mark vented frustrations about debts piling up faster than ungraded papers, blaming her for distractions that derailed his focus. A narrative that twisted my gut because it echoed the manipulative blame-shifting I'd seen in too many case files from my VA counseling days, where veteran spouses turned victims into villains to justify their own unraveling lives. And as the coffee cooled in my hand, I mapped out the day's first move in this unfolding operation, a subtle interference at the high school open house that evening where Mark would be front and center, emceeing the event with his trademark charisma that had fooled so many in our community into believing he was the pillar of stability Sophia deserved. By the time Sophia stirred and shuffled downstairs around 9, rubbing sleep from her eyes and wincing at the pull of her bruises in the bathroom mirror she'd glanced into earlier, I had breakfast laid out on the table. Scrambled eggs fluffy with cheese and toast slathered in butter, simple comforts to anchor her before the questions resumed, and as we ate in companionable silence broken only by the tick of the wall clock inherited from her grandmother, she opened up a fraction more about the fractures in her marriage, admitting that her had started as innocent office chatter about a new assistant principal's wife who flirted shamelessly at staff parties, but had morphed into Mark's obsession, fueling late-night arguments where he'd accuse Sophia of not being enough to keep him from wandering eyes, his fists following words like thunder after lightning, and I listened without interrupting, my fork pausing midair as I absorbed the layers of emotional erosion that had worn her down. Over months of isolation, her job at the local library providing scant escape since Mark had charmed her boss into flexible hours that kept her tethered to home, waiting for his moods to shift like unpredictable weather fronts rolling in from Lake Michigan. To ease the weight pressing on us both, I shared a lighthearted memory from my Marine days about a botched surveillance op in the sandbox where my team mistook a camel for enemy cover and ended up chasing shadows for hours, chuckling at how even pros could trip over their own boots in the fog of uncertainty, and Sophia managed a small smile, the first genuine one since her arrival, though it faded quickly when her phone buzzed with a text from Mark apologizing profusely with promises of counseling sessions he'd never follow through on, his words dripping with that false sincerity that made my skin crawl like cheap polyester on a hot day. I suggested we attend the open house together as a show of normalcy, a way to gauge his reactions up close without tipping our hand, and she agreed after a moment's hesitation, her nod a tentative step toward reclaiming some agency in the chaos he'd wrought. The afternoon passed in a blur of errands that doubled as reconnaissance, me dropping Sophia at the library for a short shift while I met Jax at a nondescript diner off the interstate, the kind of place where vinyl booths stuck to your thighs and the coffee came bottomless in chipped mugs, and he slid across a tablet loaded with more dirt, including access codes to Mark's school email that a contact in IT had borrowed, under the guise of routine maintenance, revealing threads of correspondence laced with desperation about covering gambling losses through petty embezzlement from PDA funds. Nothing felony level yet, but enough to tarnish his golden boy image if leaked strategically. We plotted the petty revenge for the evening event, a rigged audio loop from Mark's own public speeches on integrity, doctored subtly with overlays of his forum posts anonymized to sound like insider gripes, set to interrupt his presentation via a wireless hack on the sound system that Jax assured me was untraceable, and as we parted with a fist bump that recalled old barracks camaraderie, I quipped about how this was cleaner than any court-martial I'd witnessed, drawing his gravelly laugh that eased the knot of moral ambiguity twisting in my stomach. Because while justice felt within reach, the risk of collateral damage to Sophia's fragile world loomed large, making me question if my brand of protection was mending wounds or just reopening them wider. Back at home, we dressed casually for the open house, Sophia in a sweater that hid the fading marks, me in jeans and a blouse that screamed concerned parent rather than covert operator. And as we drove through the tree-lined streets alive with families heading to the school, the air thick with anticipation of homemade cookies and booster club pitches, I felt the plan's momentum building like a gathering storm, only to hit a subtle snag when Sophia confessed in the car that her might connect to an old photo she'd found in Mark's drawer, one showing him with a woman resembling someone from my side of the family tree, a revelation that sent a chill down my spine as we pulled into the parking lot buzzing with chatter, leaving me to wonder if the shadows we'd been chasing led straight back to secrets buried in our own backyard. Rain lashed against the windows of our cozy suburban home that evening after the open house fiasco, where the air still hummed with the echoes of Mark's flustered excuses and the crowd's murmured speculations about his sudden audio mishap that had painted him as less than the upright educator he pretended to be. And as Sophia and I pulled into the driveway slick with puddles reflecting the streetlights like shattered mirrors, she clutched the old photo she'd retrieved from Mark's drawer earlier that day, its edges frayed from years of hiding in forgotten corners, showing a younger version of him arm in arm with a woman whose sharp jawline and dark hair tugged at memories I'd stuffed away in the recesses of my mind during those long nights after my husband's death, when grief had blurred the lines between past and present, prompting me to take the picture gently from her hand as we stepped inside, the door shutting with a decisive click that sealed us from the neighborhood's prying eyes. While I studied the image under the warm glow of the entryway lamp, recognizing her not as some random fling, but as a distant echo of Aunt Lydia, my late sister's partner who'd cut ties with the family amid the bitter fallout over my father's estate distribution a decade ago. A scandal involving siphoned funds for their escape to a quieter life up in Wisconsin that left me footing the bills for Sophia's college tuition on a sergeant's pension stretched thin like overused elastic. Sophia watched me intently, her bruises now shadowed by the dim light, but her expression a cocktail of curiosity and unease as she asked if I knew the woman. Her voice tentative amid the patter of rain that seemed to underscore the unraveling threads of secrets we'd both overlooked in the rush of daily survival, and I hesitated, weighing the cost of full disclosure against the fragile trust we were rebuilding brick by brick after years of her pulling away toward Mark's orbit, ultimately opting for a partial truth by admitting it looked like an old family acquaintance whose drama had faded into irrelevance long before Sophia's wedding vows. A deception that sat heavy in my stomach like undigested diner food because while protecting her from our messy lineage felt maternal, it also isolated me further in this solo operation where every lie risked widening the chasm between us. The next morning brought a brief respite from the downpour, sunlight piercing the clouds as I drove Sophia to her library shift with promises of picking her up for lunch at our favorite corner cafe, where the sandwiches came piled high with turkey and avocado on rye bread that always left us both satisfied and sleepy. But instead of heading straight there, I veered toward the coffee shop on the edge of town where Jax waited in a corner booth nursing his usual black brew, his laptop open too. Screens filled with Mark's financial labyrinth that twisted through offshore betting apps and bounce checks disguised as charitable donations to the school's booster club. The data painting a picture of desperation that had him dipping into funds meant for field trips and scholarships, a petty theft that mirrored the way he'd stolen pieces of Sophia's spirit over time, and as Jax outlined the next phase of our plan, a targeted rerouting of his upcoming gambling payout through a shell account that would trigger overdraft fees and frozen assets without direct fingerprints leading back to us. I nodded along, my mind flashing to the ethical tightrope we walked. This clever hack born from cyber drills I'd overseen in my Marine Intel days now repurposed for personal vendetta in the heartland, where justice often moved slower than a Sunday drive. Injecting a wry comment about how if Mark's poker face was as good as his teaching persona, he might have avoided this digital ambush altogether. Drawing Jax's chuckle that cut through the tension like a well-timed radio check during a stakeout. We executed it swiftly over lattes that steamed up the window beside us, the transfer humming invisibly across servers while I fielded a call from Sophia checking in. Her voice lighter than expected as she mentioned sorting through more of Mark's things at home and finding notes hinting at blackmail attempts tied to that photo. Details that made my pulse quicken because if her encompassed Lydia's old grudge, Mark might have weaponized it to squeeze money from unexpected sources, turning our family skeletons into leverage for his sinking ship, and as I hung up with assurances of normalcy, guilt gnawed at me for withholding the hack's immediacy from Sophia. A choice that positioned me as both savior and secretive puppet master in her eyes, potentially eroding the very bond one aimed to fortify against his abuse. Afternoon unfolded into a deceptive calm at the cafe, where Sophia joined me amid the clink of silverware and aroma of fresh-baked scones, her enthusiasm bubbling over a new book recommendation that momentarily transported us from the undercurrents of revenge to the safe harbor of shared interests we'd nurtured since her childhood story hours at the very library she now staffed. But as we lingered over iced teas sweating condensation onto the Formica table, her phone vibrated with a frantic call from Mark, his tone laced with panic about bank alerts freezing his cards mid-transaction at the grocery store, blaming it all on her meddling that he swore was corporate sabotage from a rival teacher jealous of his promotion prospects. And Sophia's face paled, her fork pausing over the remnants of her salad as she glanced my way with dawning suspicion, whispering after she ended the call that his rages had escalated lately with mentions of family ties he'd uncovered through some online genealogy site, implying her wasn't just a romantic rival but a specter from our past demanding restitution, a revelation that forced me to deflect with humor about how ancestry searches often unearthed more dirt than gold, likening it to digging up backyard treasures only to find rusty nails, though inside I reeled at the proximity of the threat, realizing my deceptions might soon collide with truths Sophia deserved but wasn't ready for. We parted ways with hugs that felt heavier than usual, her heading back to work while I returned home to monitor the fallout via Jax's updates, the plan yielding small victories like Mark's canceled credit line that left him scrambling for cash advances. A satisfying pinch that echoed the control he'd exerted over Sophia for so long, yet as evening fell and I sifted through more photos from the family album prompted by her earlier hint, a deeper twist emerged in an email from an unknown sender. Lydia herself, reaching out after spotting Mark's name in local news snippets about the school scandal, warning that he'd contacted her weeks ago with threats to expose the estate fraud unless she wired funds, her words chilling because they confirmed her as a multifaceted phantom linking his greed to our buried history. And just as I absorbed this, my door buzzer sounded unexpectedly, Jax's voice crackling through the intercom with urgency about a breach in our network, an ally turning informant that could unravel everything before the next move even landed. Jax's warning about the potential breach in our network hung over me like a storm cloud refusing to break as I buzzed him up to the apartment that tense evening after Sophia had retreated to her room upstairs to process the day's revelations about Mark's deepening entanglements with our family's past, the rain from earlier now a steady drizzle that pattered against the roof like impatient fingers drumming on a tabletop, and as he stepped inside shaking off his jacket with water droplets flying in all directions, his face etched with the kind of grim determination I'd seen during those high-stakes briefings back in our deployment days when intel leaks could turn a routine patrol into a firefight. He explained in hushed tones over mugs of reheated coffee at the kitchen island that one of his freelance contacts, a former tech specialist from the squad who'd gone civilian and now moonlighted in cybersecurity, had started asking too many questions about the Harlan file, hinting at tipping off authorities if the operation veered too close to illegal territory, a betrayal that stung because loyalty in our circle was supposed to be ironclad like the oaths we swore under the flag, forcing me to weigh cutting ties immediately or doubling down with a countermeasure that involved feeding the informant false trails to muddy the waters and buy us time before the school board meeting where we'd planned Mark's next public stumble. We hashed it out methodically, Jax pulling up encrypted logs on his tablet that showed the suspect's IP pings aligning suspiciously with local police servers. A detail that escalated the uncertainty churning in my gut because while my marine-honed instincts screamed to neutralize the threat swiftly, the civilian in me recoiled at the thought of ensnaring an old comrade in a web of deception that might mirror the very manipulations Mark used on Sophia and to lighten the foreboding atmosphere. Thickening the air between us, I quipped about how stakeouts in the suburbs felt less like covert ops and more like awkward parent-teacher conferences gone wrong, drawing his reluctant snort of laughter that echoed faintly off the walls adorned with faded photos of better times. Family vacations to the Wisconsin Dells where laughter drowned out the undercurrents of loss after my husband's passing. By the time he left with assurances of containing the leak through a digital smokescreen, the clock had ticked past midnight, leaving me alone with the weight of decisions that positioned me as both architect and potential destroyer of the fragile alliances holding our revenge plot together. A role that amplified the moral dilemmas I'd pushed aside in the heat of protecting my daughter from the man who'd turned her home into a battlefield. Morning light filtered through the curtains the following day, casting long shadows across the living room where Sophia joined me for breakfast. Her movements deliberate, as if testing the waters of our renewed closeness after yesterday's cafe confessions about Mark's ancestry digs uncovering Lydia's shadow, and as we shared bowls of oatmeal topped with fresh berries from the farmer's market down the block. The kind of simple ritual that grounded us amid the chaos, I decided to loop her in deeper on the plan's contours without revealing the informant snag. Describing the school board gathering as an opportunity for a calculated exposure of Mark's fiscal indiscretions through manipulated presentation slides that would highlight discrepancies in PTA accounts without direct accusation. A witty reversal where his own words from embezzlement-tinged emails would underscore the irony of his reform speeches, and Sophia listened with a mix of apprehension and intrigue, her spoons stirring circles in her bowl as she admitted the idea thrilled her in a guilty way, reminiscent of those childhood games where we'd plot pranks on her cousins during holiday gatherings. Though the stakes here carried the real risk of backlash from a community that viewed Mark as the steady hand guiding their kids through history's lessons. We spent the afternoon prepping in the den, me demonstrating basic evasion tactics from my training manual adapted for civilian surveillance, like blending into crowds at public events or using everyday objects as distractions, while injecting humor into the drills by staging a mock stakeout in the backyard where I tripped over the garden hose pretending it was enemy wire, eliciting her genuine peal of laughter that echoed like a brief ray of sun breaking through clouds. A moment of levity that masked my inner turmoil over deceiving her about the operation's shakier elements, choices that made me question if my overreach was empowering her or merely substituting one controller for another in her life, a dilemma that tugged at the audience of my conscience, urging disagreement with the path I'd chosen despite its clever intent to dismantle Mark's hold without courtroom drama. The school board meeting that night buzzed with the energy of civic duty in the auditorium packed with folding chairs and the faint scent of stale coffee from the refreshment table. Parents and officials milling about under fluorescent lights that hummed overhead like a swarm of distant bees, and as Sophia and I took seats near the back for a clear view of the stage where Mark adjusted his tie with feigned confidence, oblivious to the USB drive jacks had planted earlier via a maintenance ruse, I felt the pulse of anticipation thrumming through me like the pre-mission jitters I'd known in far-off lands, the plan unfolding seamlessly when he launched into his pitch for the promotion. Clicking through slides that should have showcased budget efficiencies, but instead flickered to life with overlaid data extracts, his gambling tallies disguised as erroneous projections. Chat logs anonymized to imply fiscal irresponsibility phrased in his own bombastic style, prompting gasps from the board and a ripple of whispers through the crowd that built to a crescendo of pointed questions about accountability, Mark's face flushing crimson as he stammered through deflections, sweat beading on his forehead like dew on a faulty engine. The public humiliation landing with the precision of a well-aimed shot that left him exposed and diminished without a trace leading back to us. Sophia squeezed my hand under the armrest, her eyes shining with a fierce satisfaction that mirrored my own quiet triumph, the witty justice of turning his deceptions against him providing a cathartic release after months of his dominance. And as we slipped out amid the ensuing uproar, blending into the parking lot shadows where families debated the spectacle in hushed tones, I allowed myself a moment to savor the small victory, quipping to her about how Mark's lesson in transparency might finally earn him that A in irony, drawing her soft chuckle that warmed the chill autumn air. But the elation soured quickly when my phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unfamiliar Wisconsin area code, Lydia's voice emerging hesitant yet edged with urgency, revealing that Mark had escalated his extortion attempts post-meeting, demanding hush money for the estate secrets by threatening to go public with documents he'd amassed, her plea for intervention pulling at threads of old family rifts I'd hoped time had severed, and before I could respond, Sophia's device rang insistently with Mark's name flashing, her answering it on speaker to a tirade of rage about betrayal and loss, his words slurring into threats of confrontation at our home that night, the line cutting off with a chilling finality that left us frozen in the car. Headlights cutting through the darkness as the true contours of her began to sharpen into something perilously personal, forcing a confrontation that could either solidify our alliance or fracture it beyond repair. The drive back to the house that fateful night unfolded in a tense blur of rain-slicked roads and flashing dashboard lights that cast erratic shadows across Sophia's face beside me. Her hands clenched white-knuckled on the armrest as Mark's threatening call replayed in my mind like a looped briefing tape from my Marine days, his slurred vows of confrontation laced with the desperation of a man cornered by his own unraveling deceptions. And as we navigated the familiar turns through our sleeping suburb where porch lights flickered like wary sentinels, I murmured reassurances to Sophia about having backup en route from Jax's network, downplaying the peril to keep her steady, while my own pulse thrummed with the calculated calm of ops I'd led in hostile territories, though this domestic battlefield carried a personal sting that no amount of training could fully armor against, the multifaceted hurt now crystallizing into a nexus of grief and greed that bound Mark's abuses to our families. Fractured history in ways that demanded a reckoning far beyond simple arrest. We pulled up slowly to the curb, the engine's hum cutting off abruptly as headlights illuminated the porch where Mark paced erratically under the motion sensor's glow, a handgun glinting in his grip like a prop from one of those gritty cop shows that Sophia and I used to binge-watch on lazy Sundays with popcorn bowls balanced on our laps, his silhouette distorted by the downpour that plastered his shirt to his frame, revealing the toll of sleepless nights fueled by scotch and paranoia. And Sophia whispered a plea to call the police outright, her voice trembling with the raw fear of a woman who'd danced this edge too many times, but I shook my head gently, stepping out into the wet chill with hands raised in the universal gesture of non-threat. The uniform bag from the closet slung over my shoulder as a subtle reminder of the discipline anchoring me, while I instructed her via a quick text to stay low and alert. Jax, if things escalated beyond my control. Mark's eyes locked onto mine through the sheets of rain, wild and unfocused, as he waved the pistol in a sloppy arc that spoke more of bluster than precision, bellowing accusations about the school board sabotage and how her had orchestrated it all to drag him down into the abyss of his failures, his words tumbling out in a torrent that finally unveiled the tangled truths we'd chased through shadows. The her he'd weaponized wasn't just the flirtatious colleague or the miscarriage ghost that haunted Sophia's heart with unspoken what-ifs about the daughter they lost early in the marriage, but a composite phantom encompassing Lydia's estate betrayal that he'd unearthed through obsessive online sleuthing, using printed emails and forged affidavits to extort her for gambling bailouts while blaming Sophia for the cursed luck that followed their loss. A psychological house of cards built on self-pity and control that made his fists fly whenever reality intruded on his delusions of victimhood. I advanced slowly across the lawn, mud sucking at my shoes like reluctant anchors, keeping my voice level and probing as I'd been trained in de-escalation protocols during my VA shifts with agitated vets, drawing him out with questions about the specifics of his discoveries to buy time until the faint crunch of tires signaled Jax's arrival with two reliable squad mates in an unmarked van parked discreetly at the block's end, their silhouettes blending into the night as they flanked the perimeter without alerting him, and in a bid to defuse the standoff with a touch of wry deflection, I quipped that if he was going to play the aggrieved husband card, he might as well add a chapter on fiscal responsibility since his poker habits had already written the plot twists, a comment that momentarily threw him off balance, his laugh bitter and hollow like thunder rumbling distant, giving me the opening to close the gap while Sophia watched from the car, her phone dialing emergency services in silent coordination with our plan. The intervention unfolded with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed drill when Jax's team surged forward from the tree line, tackling Mark to the ground in a tangle of limbs and rain-soaked grass before he could fully react, the gun skittering harmlessly into a flower bed where petunias lay trampled like forgotten casualties, and as sirens wailed closer drawn by Sophia's call, officers swarmed the scene cuffing him amid his sputtering protests of setup and entrapment, the charges stacking swiftly. From domestic threats and illegal firearm possession to the embezzlement threads we'd anonymously tipped to investigators earlier that week, a cascade of justice that left him hauled away in the back of a squad car, his glare piercing through the window like a final desperate shot that promised grudges even from behind bars. Lydia arrived shortly after in a rental driven through the storm from her Wisconsin hideaway, her presence a whirlwind of explanations over steaming mugs of tea in the living room where Sophia and I huddled wrapped in blankets, detailing how Mark's initial contact had started innocently enough as a family tree query, but devolved into blackmail leveraging the old estate discrepancies that had severed our ties years ago. Her remorse for the financial fallout that burdened me post-Dad's passing mingling with gratitude for the intervention that neutralized the threat, and as we pieced together the mosaic of the lost baby symbolizing Mark's shattered provider dreams. Lydia as the scapegoat for his greed, and even echoes of my own armored independence that he'd resented in Sophia, the conversation stretched into the early hours, laced with tentative humor about how our clan skeletons had turned out to be more comedic farce than gothic tragedy, eliciting soft chuckles that mended some of the night's fractures. Sophia signed the divorce papers a week later in a lawyer's office smelling of fresh ink and stale coffee, her hand steady on the pen as Bruises faded into faint reminders, and as she hugged me goodbye before heading to a support group for survivors that I'd encouraged her to join, she murmured appreciation laced with a gentle admonition about trusting dialogue over covert maneuvers next time around. Words that struck home because in the quiet aftermath, folding away my uniform for what felt like the final time, I grappled with the plan's bittersweet legacy. Had my clever revenges liberated her or merely traded one form of control for another's shadow, leaving her as an enduring enigma in the hearts we fought to safeguard, a question mark hovering over whether vengeance ever truly silences the echoes of pain or just reshapes them into new uncertainties for the ones we love most.